Okay, so we are live on the air and it's recording. Okay, so I'm Scott Young. I'm the Mentor Relations Associate for Speak Mentorship Program. And today in our speaker series, we have Professor Mariam Durrani from, she's a professor of anthropology in the anthropology department at Hamilton College in Central New York. Central New York State. So she's joining us from New York today. So thank you so much for joining us. Let me know when you'd like me to put up your presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Scottney. And hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. And this is the first time that I'm doing something like this. So this is a little bit nerve-wracking, but also really exciting to be in conversation with so many different people at the same time. So I guess we could start with the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, great. So I titled my presentation today, Take Your Time, because that's something that I really want to emphasize throughout my entire talk about both myself, about what I do, and some genuine advice for everyone who's listening, that it's so important to take your time. And I'm going to first frame that from the perspective of, you know, there's a lot of expectations that girls have in the world and in different societies. And it's something that actually brings a lot of us together in a very important way, which is that there is this kind of extra responsibility to hold up certain cultural norms. And because we are expected to hold up these cultural norms much more than our brothers, our peers in class who are boys, this sometimes doesn't make us feel like we have time of our own. And so this issue is something that I want to kind of emphasize, is that like your time is your own, and that you need to have the feeling that that's something that you need to value. And when you have that feeling, and when you can kind of really own that feeling, you can hopefully enact on that feeling and take actions that make sense for what you want to do with your life and your time on this planet. So just to give you some basics about myself, I was born in Lahore, Pakistan, in 81, and my family, which included my parents and my younger brother, we all migrated to America in 1984. And my father was actually in the military, in the US Army. And so I grew up in what I like to call like the American Empire in a way. I grew up in Germany, and I also grew up in Arizona. And although Arizona is technically part of the United States, I lived about, I would say, like 20, 30 miles from the US-Mexico border. And so that's a very interesting area because it's actually historically been part of Mexico and is mostly Spanish speaking. I went to the University of Arizona in Tucson for my bachelor's degree, and I went to the University of New Mexico for my master's, and I did my PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And one of the things that I want to talk about in the next slide is the fact that I actually transitioned both in terms of my educational focus and also in terms of my professional trajectory from engineering to working as a college composition instructor to becoming an anthropology professor, and I'm also a media maker. So I make films and I make podcasts as part of my research. And another very important life-changing event was that I became a mother in 2009 to my daughter, who is now almost 9 years old. And this photo here that I have on this slide is actually a photo of me wearing a sari. And I wore this sari on the first day of class here when I started teaching at Hamilton College in September last fall. And the reason that I wore a sari is because two things. First of all, I wore it because I want to feel that my heritage is part of my present. I don't want to think of my heritage as something that I have left somewhere or that my family has left because we have physically moved locations. And so physical movement does not necessarily imply that you have to culturally like change or assimilate to the point that you don't have your past with you. And so I wore a sari for myself for that reason, because I wanted to wear a sari and own that identity of my family's. And I also wore a sari because I went to class and I said to the students, I know that a lot of people would describe what I'm wearing right now as cultural dress, right? So a sari is seen as cultural. But I wanted to kind of emphasize that this outfit is not any more cultural than anything that anybody is wearing. And that's just kind of one of the ways that I try to bring my pedagogy in through multiple ways and using different kinds of methods, including my own body and my own fashion. So this is a photo of me with my daughter. In this photo, she was 6 months, and we were having kind of like a 6-month celebration, which was more for myself because I had made it through 6 months of her being alive. And I also actually started my PhD program when I was when she was 4 months old. So she was born in May, and I started the PhD in September. And so me and her have been on this journey together, and that's a really lovely piece of I think my life that I'm very proud of. So on this page, I titled it "Not Taking Time and Taking Time," because as I tell this piece about my life, I think you'll start to hear how there's moments where I was able to exercise that right of mine to own my own time, and there were times when that wasn't possible for various reasons. And so the first thing is I grew up with my parents and my younger brother, and we all migrated together, and my parents grew up in Pakistan. And so their socialization and their childhood was in a very different context. And in that context, there was a certain way that they thought things were supposed to be in the house. And I don't think they ever really deliberately thought of it as trying to treat me and my brother in a way that wasn't fair to both of us. But there were just certain kinds of norms that they accepted about the world, that they accepted that one day it's more likely that I would get married first, for example, even though I have a younger brother. That I would be expected to do some of the same things that my mother was taught to do when she was younger. And so I remember specifically when I would say like in, middle school, like 7th, grade, I was maybe 12 or 11 years old. My mother would start teaching me how to help around in the kitchen, and I would help with the dishes, and I would help her cook, and I would also help her make roti, which is like, one of the daily breads that people eat in South Asia. And my brother was not really asked to do these things, and he was asked to do other things. And so he was socialized to do things like make sure that the trash is outside. But he was also forgiven a lot more easily when he wouldn't do things versus me, who maybe wasn't. And maybe I also just felt an extra pressure because I knew that as a girl, I was supposed to do certain things. I remember my father once told me that in a house of when there's a boy and a girl, one always expects the girl's room to be more clean. And so I would always have my room much cleaner. And I mean, this habit has lasted my whole life. I'm still very much the kind of person who likes to have everything clean and neat, but it becomes a little bit excessive sometimes if you are focusing on that instead of other things that you need to do for yourself. So I say that I grew up deep in the patriarchy because I think we all grow up deep in the patriarchy. I think we all grow up thinking that there are certain things that we're expected to do, and that that our brothers are not expected to do those things, and we're expected to also not argue about that. And so my family, my mother's side, was kind of very concerned about me getting married from a very young age, from the time that I was 16, 17, finishing high school. And it wasn't that they were immediately trying to get me married at that time, But there was this kind of like, we need to start having the conversation. My brother was not having the conversation. My brother had to not think about any of these things. And he was 1 year younger than me, right? So think about it. I was 17, he's 16. But as a 17-year-old girl, I'm expected to start thinking about marriage. And as a 17-year-old boy, he is expected to just keep his room clean and, do his homework. And I think that's one of the ways that we start losing time. We start losing that kind of sense of our own independence and our own kind of like ability to say that this is what I need to do for myself because it's important, rather than I need to do this because my parents expect me to do this, and it's also not what my parents expect anyone else, like my brother, to do this. And so I went to the University of Arizona, even though I graduated from my high school class at I was in a class of about 100. I was the second in the class in terms of my like academic standing, but partially because of the fact that my parents actually didn't know that much about the college application process in the United States, and partially because they wanted me to go to the University of Arizona because my mother's brother lived in that area. And so that was another part of kind of how I wasn't able to make a decision that I think might have been better for, yeah.
Excuse me. You cut out just a couple of seconds. Can you just backtrack just a little bit about when your parents started talking about marriage and how old you were?
Sure, yeah. So I was around, as I was saying, I was in high school. I was finishing high school, and at that time, it wasn't only my parents. I think really the pressure came from outside my parents, and I think that's another thing that's very common in more kind of traditional and conservative societies, is that there's a really important community sensibility, right? Like your extended family is very close, and that's really a good thing, because that means that you feel like you have a huge family, and everyone tries to get along. It's not always like that, but people try, and it's a nice feeling. But then that also means that sometimes people have a lot of opinions about the girls in the family and what they should be doing. And so one of the things that would happen is that when I was like 17, my mother's older sister, whose daughter did get married at I believe 19, started to nudge my mother that like, oh, you should start thinking about this. In Pakistan, there's this thing that like, good rishtas or good marriage proposals are hard to find. And so, everybody was constantly like look on the lookout for like a doctor or an engineer or somebody who is accomplished and 10 years older than me and would be able to like, provide for me, is the idea. Not ever thinking that I could provide for myself, that I could become completely independent on my own, and then I could get married. No, the kind of like complete acceptance by most people was that I will have to eventually be with someone who is more educated, more accomplished, and earns more money than I do. Anyway, so that conversation started, and my brother did not have that conversation happening for him. He's 1 year younger than me, literally 15 months. So not even that big of an age difference. And he did not have to worry about this. Nobody was concerned about his marriage when he was 17 or 18 years old. And that was one of the things that I think just kind of like embedded itself into my brain. And it was always there. It was always like, I don't have that much time. Like, I don't have that much time to be single. I don't have that much time to enjoy my education. Eventually I will have to think about marriage. And actually, the first time that it became very real was when I was in college. So I went to the University of Arizona, and I went to Arizona partially because my mother's older brother lived in that area. And when I went to college, first of all, I chose to study engineering. And I chose engineering for two reasons. One reason is because I wanted to study medicine when I was in college, and I thought that choosing medicine meant that I would end up being in college for a very long time. And when I was, 18, 19 years old, I thought I don't want to be in college for the rest of my life. I mean, the irony is, of course, that I am now a professor at a college, but when I was 18, I thought I didn't want to do that. And I was also thinking that I might not be able to finish if I end up having to go from college. In America, it's 4 years of college, then you have 4 years of medical school, and then you usually have another 3 years of a residency. And so I was thinking of this kind of like, 13, no, how many years is that? Almost like 11 years, 12 years of your life. And I just kind of decided to choose engineering because I felt that that was a profession that I could complete a 4-year degree in and then go on to get a job. Because I thought I didn't have time. And I think that was one of those moments where I didn't do it. I got scared. And then I really did enjoy studying engineering, but I enjoy studying a lot of different things, and that has become more obvious now that I am in a completely different field than I was when I was, graduated from my undergrad with a degree in engineering. I also, while I was doing my college degree, my parents introduced me to someone who was actually a very nice man. He was, I believe he was maybe 27, 28 when we met, and I was 19 or 20. And he was a dentist. He lived in Chicago. He was, we knew him like in the family. He might have been like my mother's like relative, kind of from a distance. And I thought he was a nice person. I think that's what was really hard about that moment, was that he was actually a very nice person. And so when I met him, I did enjoy spending time with him. I thought he was nice to talk to. And I met him because my parents, they arranged our meeting. And I think one time my mother and my aunt asked me, "What do you think about him?" And I said, "I think he's nice." And then I was sitting in a living room with my parents and his parents. And then all of a sudden, everyone started congratulating each other. And it seemed like there was some kind of agreement that we were getting engaged. And I was really shocked because I didn't say that I wanted to get engaged. I just said that I thought he was nice. But I think for them, culturally, like that meant something that was much more than what I thought. And so that was a moment where it went really quickly and I didn't know what to say. And so I didn't say anything when all these adults were getting very emotional and excited about the two of us getting engaged. And then I remember it was like the next week I was in college, I was back at college, and I was just completely freaking out. I was like, this is not how I feel. I don't feel that this is right. I'm not ready for this. And I actually told him that. So the next time that he came to visit me, because he lived in Chicago, right? And I lived in Arizona, so that's about a, 2-3 hour flight. He came to visit, and I told him directly that I am not ready, and I won't be able to get engaged to you. I didn't feel that it was right for me to make him think that I was going to. And he was very respectful, and he didn't say anything like rude or anything. He just said, okay, like that's fine, and he left, and my family was not happy about this decision. They did not appreciate that I did this. They thought that I was very ungrateful, and that I disrespected the family. And my mother said that to me. She was very explicit at that time about how she felt. And I think it's important to talk about this because even though things are very different now, at that time, as a 19-year-old girl in college, that was very hard. It was very hard to feel that I disappointed my parents. It was very hard to feel that I disrespected my mother. And she really felt that way. I I mean, she was not right is the other piece. She was wrong for doing that. And I think I can say that now without being angry about it, but for a long time I was very upset and hurt that that she didn't value what I was saying and appreciate the fact that I needed more time. I wasn't ready to get married, and I don't ever regret that decision. That was one of the best things that I did for everyone. And you know, he went on and he got married and he has 3 children and he's very happy. And life moves on for everyone. So even though in those moments it feels very kind of overwhelming, it doesn't actually work out that way. Things pass. Time has a way of actually like making things better for everyone. And so I did my undergrad degree. I ended up moving I moved to California after I finished my undergrad degree, and I started working in San Diego at a firm, at a engineering firm there. And I also was writing a lot at that time. I was thinking a lot about being Muslim in America. You know, September 11th, 2001 happened when I was still in college. And so being a Muslim girl in Arizona after 9/11 was a very kind of, it really kind of woke me up and made me realize that there's so much going on in the world that I need to pay more attention to. And it really impacts me, and it also impacts people that I love. And so I started to write while I was in college, and I actually applied to do my master's when I was in college, and I also applied for jobs. I ended up not deciding to do the master's, and I decided to do the job first because I thought it was better to earn money. But I think that was another moment where I thought I couldn't take the time to go for my education at that time. I just didn't feel like I had to do that. I thought I should go and become an adult and start working. And I moved to California. I started a job. I worked with mostly men because engineering is oftentimes a very male profession. And I ended up having an experience of sexual harassment at my workplace. And that was another moment where I had to step up and say, like, this is not right. You can't do this. And that was very helpful because it made me have to assert my rights in a very clear way. And I think it was another moment that was very scary, but also a very defining moment for me. I ended up getting married in 2007. So I did my master's degree from the University of New Mexico, and I actually was living at home with my parents during that time, which was a very stressful time again, because now I was 23 and 24 years old, and I was still unmarried, and every girl in my family was married except for me. And everyone had an opinion about the fact that I was still unmarried. And it was very hard. It was very hard to do my master's with this constant chatter about marriage all the time. So I actually moved to Pakistan in 2006 when I finished my master's, and I taught in Lahore. And I also was, so I was teaching in Lahore, and my college boyfriend was also, who was from Pakistan, was living in Pakistan at that time. And we ended up deciding to get married when I was 25. We got married in 2007. And I think that was another moment where I got married a little early. I definitely got married because I wanted to get married. I was not forced to get married, but it was more of like an internal pressure that I should be married by now, that it was time. And it wasn't time. There's no reason to think that you have to get married at any age, whether you're 25 or whether you're 30 or whether you're 35. Honestly, I think that's a really big misconception. But that said, I did decide to get married, and my first husband was very he did encourage me to apply for a PhD. He knew that I wanted to do a PhD because I was teaching at universities in Lahore. When I moved to Karachi, because that's where his job was, I started teaching at universities in Karachi. I was involved in all kinds of educational development programs and nonprofits. And so he did encourage that. And I am very grateful that he actually did encourage me to go and apply for a PhD. And so I did get accepted to the University of Pennsylvania, but I got accepted after I got pregnant, which was very difficult because it was kind of like, how am I going to do this? But I just decided that I had to do it. And my husband said that he would be willing to move to America, back to America, so that I could do my PhD. And so we moved back, and my daughter was born. And then 4 months later, I started the PhD. So that photo is of me in my first semester, almost 9 years ago. And I have to say that me going for the PhD definitely changed things between me and him, because I was very excited. I was starting a new chapter of my life, as an academic. And I think that he didn't react to that very well. I think it was one of those things where the idea was very good, and he is a good person. So I think the idea was something that he supported, but he wasn't necessarily able to support me in the moment. And those are two very different things, which I have learned, is sometimes people are able to tell you that they support you, but they're not able to do the things that are actually supportive. And so a very small example is that when I was, I was still breastfeeding. So I would breastfeed, and then I would go to class, and then I would rush home so I could, take care of my daughter again. And so it was this thing where I was taking classes. I was in, the PhD program. I was taking care of my daughter, who is a newborn, who was very young and, needed a lot of attention. And I was then expected to come home and cook. I was expected to clean, and I was expected to make my husband's life, easier in all these other ways. And I remember one day I said, I really need you to tell me 2 nights a week that you can cook dinner, because I can't do it every night. I'm exhausted. I'm physically unable to do this. I'm emotionally exhausted. So I need your help. And he said, no. He said, you can't expect me to be doing these things in this way. This is not he just basically said no. So that was one of those moments where I was like, wow, okay. So I don't know what to say. I was very upset, obviously, at that time, but it was kind of one of those things that eventually led to us separating and then divorcing, was that I couldn't sustain so much, so many expectations. And it really caused a big rift in our relationship. And even though later, I think, it just caused a lot of issues. And I think it took me a little longer actually to get divorced than I should have. I think maybe I could have realized it earlier, but because I was so deeply socialized to not get divorced, and in my family, nobody had gotten divorced. No one. So the fact that I even brought it up was a big problem. And then my family also didn't understand, because they said, he doesn't beat you. He's not alcoholic. He's not hurting you. Why are you doing this? Marriage is hard, and marriage is hard, but you need to have two people who are willing to work together. And when it's only one person who feels like they have to do all the work, it's very hard to sustain a relationship like that. And so I think that was another time where I took time back, and I said, if I'm taking care of my daughter, and I'm doing my, work, which I want to do, I need to have time in the evenings to not worry about somebody else. I can't do that. So, I got divorced in 2013. I finished my PhD in 2016. So that's 3 years where I was a single mother, and I was also a graduate student. And it was very, very hard. But I think I had a very strong support system. I had a family who did help me with my daughter. they weren't always helpful to me when it comes to my emotional needs, but they were very helpful to me when it came to loving her and giving her attention. I also worked on, my relationship with my with her father, and we have found a way for us to prioritize her happiness, and put our past in the past and not bring that up anymore. And that's taken a long time. Really, it didn't happen very easily. And then I started. I got a job. I was very excited. I ended up getting a fellowship at Harvard, and I did that last year, so 2016 to 2017. And then I was offered a tenure track position at Hamilton, and that was also, in some sense, this was one of those moments where I was like, I made it, because when I was divorced and I was a single mom and I was a grad student, I don't know if everybody was expecting me to do it, but I did definitely take my time. I definitely asked for help when I needed help, and I finished. And I'm very grateful for all the support that I received, and I'm proud of the fact that I got there. So here are some of the daily activities of being an anthropology professor. So as a person who teaches, I design my classes and I design assignments. Like I was saying before, I really do try to center like the non-dominant way of thinking about research and thinking about scholarship and culture. So as I was talking earlier about like wearing a sari to the first day of class, I meet and advise students, and that's kind of one of the best parts of my job, is talking to young people and thinking about what they want to do with their life and helping them kind of get there. That's one of my favorite things. I do research. I make films. I'm in the process of making a film right now about a undocumented Muslim man who lives in New York City. He's also a college student, and he's also a stand-up comedian. And so it's a really interesting project where we're thinking about all these different pieces of his life together. I love talking to young people. That's one of my favorite things about my job. My research is mostly with young Muslims, but also college students. And I present my research to different audiences. So this photo right here, I'm the person on the far right, and I'm on the stage with Maori Carmel and Professor John Jackson and Professor Khatija White. And we were having a conversation in this photo about how the Oscars were, hashtag Oscars so white, and the fact that that movie awards shows and Hollywood more generally is dominated by white faces and stories about white people, and not really center other people. And so this is one of those things where it's like not necessarily like what my research is about, but I think I get to be involved in a lot of different things, and I really like enjoy that. It's very fun to think about different ideas. And I also speak out a lot on social justice issues. I give talks about hate speech and free speech in America, and talking about Islamophobia and how that impacts Muslim youth. I write about racial and gender justice, and my Twitter handle is right there if people are interested in learning more about my work and reaching out. Yeah. Am I going over time?
No, well, no. You're doing great. This is so fantastic. Thank you. You just cut out a little bit at the beginning, so I just was wondering if you could just talk just quickly about some of the courses that you design.
Oh, yeah, I would love to. So, some of the courses that I teach a class called Anthropology of Muslim Youth. And in this class, we read a lot about kind of Islamophobia, but we also read about kind of Muslims' youth lives and like how young Muslims actually live. And students make a podcast in this class. I teach another class right now, which is on migration. And the students are making short films about that focus on the story of one person who is migrated and their family story, because usually when a person migrates, it doesn't just affect one person, it affects their whole family in some way, even if they all don't move together. And I also teach about language. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, so I talk a lot about language and linguistics in language and culture. So how I got here, I definitely, first thing is that I think it's important to feel empowered to speak up when you have something to say. This really started for me when I started writing for my college newspaper after 9/11. And when I was sexually harassed when I was, 21 years old, um, you have to speak up. And I spoke up when I wasn't ready to get married. And I said I needed to, not be engaged to this person. Speaking up when I had to get a divorce. You have to be able to speak up and represent yourself because no one else is going to do it for you. No one. You have to be able to take risks and not worry that if you take a risk that it's going to be a huge, disaster. Like I think when I left my job in California, most of my family thought it was very strange. And I will say, like financially, I was independent at that time, and now I am independent because now I am also earning, I have a full-time job. I'm not a graduate student. Being a graduate student is not like the time where you make money. But that's okay because I'm so happy that I'm here now and I really have a very, I think, fulfilling job. So I think if you feel that you have chosen a subject or a degree that you are not completely comfortable with and you are happy about, talk to people, who are doing work in different fields, learn as much as you can, and make a decision once you think you know enough that you feel comfortable to make that decision, even if other people are very, skeptical. Because people have been skeptical of a lot of my decisions, and I understand that it might not be for them, but I was making a decision for myself. Um, I think finding mentors is very important. My master's thesis advisor was, I think, the first person who told me that she thinks I could be an academic. And given the fact that at home, I was being told that I should get married, I should get married, I should get married, the fact that someone said, you really are, you're really good at this. You should think about doing a PhD. You might really like enjoy it. And she was completely right. So I think cultivating relationships with mentors who are able to give you that kind of like encouragement is so important. And from the mentor side, sometimes it's really surprising that, when I have students come and tell me, because I've been teaching since 2004. So it's been more than 10 years now. And I have students who have, grown up and gotten married and have their own children now. And they do still remember certain things that even I've forgotten, right? So like, I think it's really good to have relationships with people who can kind of provide that encouraging role and say like, you should do it. Even if sometimes, other people are telling you the opposite. And then surround yourself with people who you admire and people that you want to learn from, and make sure that your personal relationships are holding you up and not holding you back. And I think it's the same thing of like people who actually listen and try to pay attention and see things from your point of view as opposed to seeing it from their point of view. So things that can help: reach out to people, create a mentoring community. I have a little thing in here about the informational interview. That's a really important piece to make sure that sometimes you can just reach out to someone and say, I just want to have coffee with you. It's not even like you're trying to get a job from them, but you just want to talk to them and say, tell me about what you do. Tell me how you got there. Kind of like what I was just doing. Someone could do a little bit of that. I would say also to make strategic plans where you plan 4 months at a time. And then you also then break that 4-month, those goals into like monthly goals and weekly goals. And then you have daily goals, because I think that's something that we don't get maybe taught how to do that, but that's a really important skill that one should learn. And I think to create accountability for yourself, to have friends who support you, but then also tell you, hey, like, remember you said you were going to do this, but you're not doing it. How come? Like, why'd you stop? And make decisions for yourself. This is a little graph that I included here, which shows like how much time I spend doing different things per week. And I think that's just a way of, again, being accountable for yourself and being like, oh, am I spending enough time on the things that I need to spend time on? And as you can see, I wasn't spending as much time on certain things because I was prioritizing other things. So I prioritized sleep. And I definitely think that getting enough sleep is a really big part of being a healthy person. Um, so the big takeaways, and this is my daughter, I think maybe 2 years ago, and I really like this photo because it looks like very positive. So take your time. Again, believe in yourself, and when you think that you need to make a decision or change in your life, believe that that's important. Don't worry about what everyone thinks. Worry about what you think and the people that really matter to you. And even sometimes the people that matter to you might not support the decisions that you want to make. And that's okay. You can say that I appreciate your care, but I have to do something that makes more, that feels right for me. And that's not that you don't care about them. That's not how care works. Care isn't that you have to like listen to what the other person says all the time. Um, and I think stay focused. Not get distracted by what people say, what your boyfriend says, what your best friend says. Like, remember that sometimes, we're all on our own journeys, and sometimes we cross paths with people for a year, for 5 years, for 10 years, and sometimes it's the relationship has passed, and that's okay. That's totally fine. That doesn't mean anything bad. And this is just my contact information. So if you're interested in reaching out to me, please feel free to do that. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Scottney, are you there?
Okay. Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. If you could just go back a moment, it cut out just on that last key sentence, and I really wanted to hear that.
What was the sentence?
Let me see. So you were saying surround yourself with sort of people, and kind of just how even when it's someone that you do care about, that it's not your decision.
Right. Yeah. So I think sometimes people have this way of thinking that like if you don't listen to what they tell you to do, that you are somehow either disrespecting them or not caring about them. I mean, sometimes parents say things like that. My mother specifically, when I was in college and I decided that I didn't want to get engaged to that person, she specifically said to me, I remember that you've cut our nose. And that's like a very big thing to say in Pakistan, as kind of like you have dishonored us. And I didn't, that's not what I did. That was her emotions, and that was her, and that was in me. And it took me a long time, I think, to kind of be able to make that distinction and to say that I do care about my mother. Of course, I care about her a lot, but I also have to care about myself. And sometimes what she wants isn't the best thing for me. And so that was a moment where I had to say no. And I think eventually she understood, but it took a really long time. And that's okay too, because that's her story of figuring out that was okay. But don't let that like change your life. I can't even imagine if I married that person, it would have been a complete disaster. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, so yeah, let's make sure we get your details up here. Thank you so much. That was so enlightening and inspiring. I have a few questions for you, some just to kind of clarify and some to just get some more background on some of the things that you mentioned. So how exactly did you make that transition from engineering to teaching, and what kind of really drove that? I mean, you mentioned your experience in California, but how did you kind of find that passion in the first place for teaching?
Yeah. So what happened is, I had applied to do my master's when I was still in college, and I had gotten into this college, to Carnegie Mellon University, but I was not prepared to financially take that price tag of Carnegie Mellon on at that time. And I decided to go for the job. And I was working, but then I was really unhappy with the job. And I had a hard time kind of like accepting that this is what I was going to do for the next like 10 years. That was what I was thinking, because a lot of the people that I worked with had been there for a long time, and that was kind of like that was their career. And I wasn't ready for that. And then I applied to the University of New Mexico. And I applied there just because of the fact that my parents were living in Albuquerque, and they said, why don't you think about moving back home? So what I had done is I had deferred Carnegie Mellon for 1 year. So I had given myself that year to kind of figure out if I wanted to go there or not. And I had also then applied to the University of New Mexico. And one of the things about some of these large public universities is that they give you these teaching assistantships. And the teaching assistantship ends up being pays for your tuition, and it also gives you a stipend and health insurance. It's kind of a really amazing gig. And so I got a TA-ship at UNM. And so I showed up and I was like, okay, like I got a free master's basically. I'm going to take it. And when I started the TA-ship, I was teaching freshmen writing, like first year writing courses at the University of New Mexico, you know, like as a 24-year-old. And maybe I was even younger than that. I don't know, 23. And I loved it. I just loved the whole thing. I just loved the idea that I could like be in a classroom and like that students, that I could do something that might help them and that they were learning something. And I think that maybe the first semester it was more of like I learned something and my students weren't learning nearly as much as I was, because I was learning what it meant to be a teacher. But you know, now I've been doing it for almost like 14 years. So like it's something that I just completely fell in love with, and I didn't even know it. I hadn't even really considered it as a career until I did it. And then so I think that goes to show that sometimes you should just try things even if you're totally not sure about it, because you might end up really loving it. And if you don't love it, that means that that's something you shouldn't do, and that's okay. You can leave it.
Yeah, that's great. That definitely is often the case with a lot of people and how they find their passions. You kind of just fall into it sometimes.
Yeah.
So how exactly did you find out about that particular fellowship, and like how would you encourage some of our mentees to like, where would they start looking for some of those?
I think what you want to do is you want to definitely email the people who are like the advisors at in the programs that you're applying to, and be really forthcoming about your situation. So if you're looking for additional employment on campus, there are all kinds of jobs that are available on college campuses. There's jobs in administrative roles. There's jobs like in the dorms. You know, that's another really great way of getting a job and also then having a place to live. And having some extra money. When you're a graduate student, there are jobs to teach on campus once you've kind of like gone through some training. So they asked us to come that summer, I think, for like a 2-week training that then prepared us to be TAs. And I also was taking a class, I remember at the same time, which was about like composition pedagogy and thinking about how to teach writing. And so I think that's really important, is to like be in conversation with college advisors, telling them very clearly if this is what I need. And then also to like have mentors who would know something and would be able to like tell you some of the inside story. Because sometimes there's like the official story that you get from the advisors, and then there's this inside story that you find out once you talk to somebody who knows how to get through it. So I remember I had a student from Pakistan who was coming to the University of Pennsylvania for his master's in public policy. And he was struggling with where was he going to live, how was he going to afford coming here, and you know, all of these pieces. And I remember that I set him up with the residential life program on campus, and he was a RA for those 2 years, and that was how he did it. He lived on campus, and it also helped him become a part of the community in a way that he wouldn't have been if he had been living off campus with other, you know, other students from Pakistan. He wouldn't have had the same experience. And I think so there's all these ways of like kind of making sure that you talk to people, both kind of the official advisors and then also have like your mentors who can guide you and connect you to people.
Yeah, yes, that's so great. As a former RA, I completely agree with that. So you mentioned kind of how difficult it is sometimes to stand up for yourself and kind of hold your ground if you think you want to do something that the people around you maybe don't want you to do. What do you like? What's the aftermath of that? How do you handle, like you said, your parents were really disappointed when you broke your engagement or quit your job? You know, how do you get through that?
I think you really have to talk to your friends. I think like, I mean, it's a social thing. Because one piece is, of course, taking care of yourself, right? Like I should say that, making sure that you eat well, still exercise, like all of these things actually are important, and to not get into behaviors that are really like destructive or self-soothing using like substances or cigarettes, or like just zoning out from life and watching TV for like 10 hours. Like things like that are not healthy. You know, like you do it for maybe a day or for 2 days, but if you're doing that for like 3 months, there's something else that you need to do, because that's not actually helping you deal with the problem, with the feeling that you're having. And so I've found that like talking to people is a really important part of like getting the feeling out, and talking to people who will listen to you, who won't judge you, who won't make you feel bad. So I remember when I was in New Mexico, I had a best friend whose house I would basically crash at when my mother was really kind of like, making me feel sad and hurt. And I used to just go and like stay with her, and it was a safe space for me. And so I think having that support network somehow, it could be a teacher, it could be a friend's older sister who you talk to. Like sometimes it's just good to kind of like tell people that like you want to talk about something, and it's not always that they'll listen. Sometimes they won't, and that's something that is a little bit of a risk. But if you already have someone in your life that you think you can trust, to like rely on that person and not feel like you're being like what's the word that people say, like I don't want to burden you, that you're being like a burden, or that you're like kind of bothering them. Because if it reaches that point, then hopefully they will have the ability to say like, listen, I can't right now. I have some other stuff going on. You know what I mean? So like everybody has that right to do that. And you should ask for help too if you want help, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So a last question I wanted to ask before we run out of time. So you mentioned at the beginning how you wore your sari to class on the first day, and there's obviously a lot about your culture that you find very important to carry with you. I like how you said you want it to be a part of your present, your presence and your present moment. But then also kind of there's also parts of our culture. Our subculture, whatever culture we're in, that maybe we don't like so much. You mentioned a lot of the gender expectations. How do you decide what parts of your culture you want to keep with you, and what parts that you don't like, or you think you would rather not?
mm. Yeah, I think that's a really hard question. I mean, like part of it is almost like even the parts that aren't good for you, it's like you still carry them, right? Like there's still that voice in your head that's like telling you that like, who do you think you are? What are you doing? Like how. Um, so I think part of it is, I can't emphasize enough like having like a community to talk to about these issues, so you don't feel alone. I can imagine that if somebody is like for a young for a young person who is trying to assert a piece of their identity that seems to be almost like antithetical to the larger community, right? So like I'm thinking of like queer Muslim youth, right? So how do you kind of reconcile this piece where like on the one hand you have grown up as a Muslim, but then on the other hand there's a lot of people that believe that homosexuality is not permitted in Islam, but there are also people who don't do that, who don't see it as something that is not permitted. And that's in actually a lot of religions, right? Like that's in Christianity, that's in Judaism, that's in Hinduism. So I think it's talking to people and reaching out and like listening to stories and reading books about people who have already done this work, and learning from that knowledge and wisdom, and then seeing how that fits for you. And I think for me, a lot of the times I get so much kind of strength from reading like a really good like feminist memoir. I'm like, yeah, like look what she did, look how she did this. I could do it too. And like the more stories I hear of like women making their life the way that they wanted to look and being happy, I feel empowered that like, oh, I could do that too. I can make all these kinds of like changes, and I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. Like, this is not like, it feels that way, but part of what you have to do is like to get rid of that feeling is to like find other ways of learning how people have done that.
Yeah, absolutely. For some of the young women that might be listening, do you have a suggestion or two for a great book that might be a good read?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, like, one book is let's see. I'm almost immediately going into like my like scholarly book, so I'm like, okay, like, let me think of something that like someone in high school would want to read. Um, so I'm reading this really great book right now. It's called Living a Feminist Life. And it's written in a way that isn't so kind of like that isn't so dense and so academic. So I think that's like the one book that I would say that is an excellent book. And it's written by Sara Ahmed, Sara, and her last name is Ahmed, Ahmed. I would say to read Bell Hooks. You know, she is one of those writers that really lays it out and says things plainly, and almost everything that she writes is kind of like amazing. Angela Davis, she wrote this book called How We Get Free. And sorry, no, that's not hers. Hers was something else. How We Get Free is another book, but that's another one. So like, I think like these kinds of books that like are written by women of color feminists are like the intellectual gems that like people don't appreciate nearly enough. And I think that's really important. And like movies, I mean, like, I cried in Moana. Like, I mean, you know, like, it doesn't even have to be that like deep. Um, it's like, I thought that when she like left the island and left on the boat, I was like, oh my God, like, yes, like, you know. And so it's like all different ways of thinking about how these feminist like memoirs and like stories get told that empower the audience to believe that, yeah, like, it's not just me. There's these other stories too.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Some really great suggestions. And I just want to thank you so much for your time. We had quite a few people joining us from Facebook Live, so I hope you all enjoyed that as well, as much as I did. I'm just going to throw this up here just to remind everybody that April 14th is our next speaker series featuring Miss Carmen Long. And so hopefully you can join us for that as well. And again, thank you so much, Professor Durrani. It was such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much. And yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to me, my information is there. So
yes, your information is here, and we'll have this information on our Facebook page as well.
great.
So reach
Awesome.
out.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.